Bullets don't do much against ancient supernatural monsters, but that definitely doesn't stop our heroes from mag dumping everything in sight. And honestly, thank God for that, because The Mummy Returns basically takes everything that made the first movie fun and just cranks it up to 11. Bigger fights, more chaos, more stuff exploding, and somehow even more guns. Set in the early 1930s, this movie is absolutely packed with all different kinds of firearms, from old school revolvers and shotguns to full-on machine guns spraying everything in sight. It's ridiculous, it's awesome, and it's exactly why I can throw this movie on anytime and instantly get hit with a wave of nostalgia. So, let's jump back into the desert and break down the guns of The Mummy Returns. One of the most interesting weapons seen in this film is the Steyr-Solothurn S1-100, better known by its Austrian military designation, the MP-34, a gun widely nicknamed the Rolls-Royce of submachine guns because of how beautifully it was made. This thing comes from a brief window in history when submachine guns weren't designed to be cheap, disposable tools of total war, but finely crafted professional weapons built with the same mindset as a sporting rifle. The reason it carries the unusual Steyr-Solothurn name has everything to do with the political fallout of World War I. After the war, Germany was heavily restricted by the Treaty of Versailles, which severely limited its ability to design, manufacture, and export new military weapons. To get around those restrictions, German arms companies like Rheinmetall began quietly routing weapons development through neutral countries, and that's where Solothurn comes in, a Swiss-based firm that acted as a legal and political workaround, allowing German designers to continue developing and selling arms without technically violating post-war treaties. Solothurn itself wasn't equipped for large-scale production, so manufacturing was handed off to Steyr in Austria, one of Europe's most experienced and capable gun makers. The result was a weapon that was German in design philosophy, Swiss in legal identity, and Austrian in manufacturing, a perfect snapshot of how interwar European weapons development was shaped just as much by politics and money as it was by engineering. Mechanically, the MP-34 is a select-fire, open-bolt blowback submachine gun, but one of its most distinctive features is that the return spring actually lives inside the wooden stock, connected to the bolt by a long linkage and rod arrangement. It's an uncommon layout, and paired with its high-quality materials and machining, it made the MP-34 smooth, controllable, and very reliable, but also very expensive. And that's ultimately why guns like this didn't really survive the realities of World War II, replaced by cheaper stamped designs, making the MP-34 one of the last examples of old world craftsmanship applied to automatic weapons. In the film, we can see the Solothurn used a couple of times, most notably by one of the cultists during the ambush on O'Connell's home, or later when they're trying to save Evelyn, we can see Lochnaw tossing one to Mila. In the first film, we see O'Connell's character sporting the Winchester Model 1897 throughout most of the movie.
I know my treasure.
But for this film, interestingly enough, he seems to kick it back a decade in time, for he can be seen using the Winchester Model 1887.
You want the shotgun?
No, I prefer the Thompson.
During the bus chase in the film, after dropping it, we can see Evelyn get off a few shots with the Winchester as well. The Winchester Model 1887 was no doubt one of the most iconic and unconventional firearms of the late 19th century. Designed by none other than the king himself, John Moses Browning, the Model 1887 was Winchester's attempt to bring their widely popular lever-action system into the world of shotguns, largely because the company still believed lever guns were the future, even after John Browning had already shown them an early pump-action design. On paper, it was kind of a wild idea. Unlike later shotguns built from steel, the early 1887s used iron and early steel receivers that were originally intended for black powder loads, giving the gun that unmistakable old-world look and feel, though later reinforced versions, most notably the 1901 variant, were built to handle smokeless powder. Mechanically, it operates just like a classic Winchester rifle, cycling shells through a lever action, which sounds cool but came with trade-offs, making the gun slightly heavier, a little more complex, and slower to reload compared to pump-action designs that would soon follow. Still, for a brief moment in history, the 1887 represented the cutting edge of repeating shotgun technology, finding use with civilians, lawmen, and even some foreign military buyers. It was powerful, it was intimidating, and absolutely devastating at close range. But it was also a technological dead end, as smokeless powder became the standard, and pump-action shotguns like the Winchester 1897 proved faster, stronger, and cheaper to produce. The lever-action shotgun quietly faded away. Today, the Model 1887 stands as a fascinating evolutionary branch in firearms history, a shotgun built with 19th century thinking, bridging the gap between the Old West and the modern repeating shotguns that would soon dominate the battlefield and the big screen. One of the most terrifying weapons you'll see in this film, and honestly, maybe the most terrifying, is the flamethrower.
My fucking loose! Kristen the Nazi's there!
Which we see used by some of the cultists during the excavation of Hamunaptra. Now, this is easily one of the toughest weapons in the movie to identify, mainly because it's only on screen for literally a couple seconds, and it's never shown in a real clear close-up. However, visually, it appears to be styled after early European military flamethrowers, possibly something along the lines of later German designs, like the Flamethrower 35, although that would be slightly anachronistic, since the film takes place in 1933, and that model wouldn't be introduced until a few years later in 1935. Either way, what we're clearly looking at is a flamethrower, and that gives us plenty to talk about.
Shit, that's right. Alright, that's too hot. Anything we can do about that heat?
Rick, it's a flamethrower.
Yeah.
Unlike most of the other weapons in this movie, this isn't something that was ever meant to be precise or subtle. Flamethrowers were designed for mainly one important purpose: to force enemies out of places they refused to leave. During major global conflicts like World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War, armies would constantly run into fortified enemy positions, such as tunnels, bunkers, or even caves, where rifles, machine guns, and grenades just weren't always enough to force enemies out. And that's where the flamethrower came in, and it was one brutal solution to the problem. In its most basic form, a flamethrower works by carrying flammable fuel in a tank that normally sits on the operator's back like a backpack. The type of fuel can differ, but normally it's a thickened, petroleum-based liquid fuel, such as a gasoline diesel mix or napalm, the latter being more utilized during World War II. Then, using pressurized gas to push that fuel through a nozzle or lance, the fuel is ignited as it leaves the weapon. This creates a sustained stream of fire that can be aimed into trenches, dugouts, or defensive positions. But the real power of the flamethrower was never just physical, it was psychological. The sight, sound, and sheer terror of fire being sprayed into a confined space often caused panic almost instantly. Defenders would abandon positions or surrender outright, knowing that if they stayed put, they could be burned alive, which is easily one of the most agonizing ways to die. There's many accounts of how when Germany first introduced the flamethrower in World War I, French soldiers would just run out into no man's land and basically choose to get mowed down by a machine gun rather than face a flamethrower. And honestly, I don't really blame them. The fear of being burned alive caused significant, lasting psychological distress to enemy troops, often causing them to retreat before the flames even reached them. However, you've got to have some real balls to want to be the operator of this thing, because the flamethrower operator probably had to get closer than anybody else to the enemy's positions. With a range of about 20 to 40 yards when firing it, you had to get real up close and personal for it to be effective. This made them instant targets for machine gunners or riflemen. Flamethrower operators would almost always get singled out immediately, leading to extremely high casualty rates. Not to mention, once you put this thing on your back, you're now basically a walking Molotov, since the tank could turn you into a human torch if hit by bullets or shrapnel, making flamethrowers one of the most high-risk weapons ever issued to infantry squads. Because of that danger, flamethrowers were never standard-issue weapons. They were typically carried by specially trained assault troops and only brought out when a position absolutely needed to be cleared. And while flamethrowers first gained widespread military use in the early 20th century, their designs evolved and stuck around for decades, seeing use on the battlefields all the way up to the Vietnam War, when their use started to greatly be reduced. If there was a list of the most terrifying weapons used in wars, I would assume the flamethrower would be sitting in the top 3. One of my favorite guns that shows up in this movie is the M1928 Thompson submachine gun.
You want the shotgun? No, I prefer the Thompson.
Ardith uses it during the rescue of Evelyn, and it's a great pick for the time period. The 1928 model is essentially the refined version of the earlier 1921, improving a lot of the problems that first generation had. If you've seen my video on public enemies, you might remember how the 1921 had a ridiculous rate of fire, about 800 to 900 rounds per minute. And this caused a lot of issues, such as being very hard to control, it would burn through ammo at a ridiculous rate, and climbed like hell when fired in full auto. So the Auto Ordnance Company decided with the 1928 to turn down that RPM just a little to around 600 to 700 rounds per minute. This allowed the gun to be much easier to control, allow for more practical burst of automatic fire, and overall save it from burning through tons of ammo in mere seconds. Most of this was achieved by simply adding in a heavier actuator combined with a much stronger recoil spring. Another very distinctive feature of the 1928 was the addition of the cuts compensator, which not only became visually iconic with the gun itself, but greatly helped to reduce the muzzle climb. Now the cuts compensator wouldn't just be distinctive to the 1928 version alone, as many of the unsold 1921s would later be modified with the compensators as well. In terms of its historical use too, this is where the Thompson really started to take off, as it saw wide use by law enforcement, FBI, prison guards, bank guards, gangsters, obviously, but by this point, the US military was also looking to get their hands on some. This led to versions like the 1928 A1, which featured the distinctive horizontal foregrip for the first time over the standard vertical pistol grip. The military switched to a horizontal foregrip mostly for practicality, since it was easier to control and worked better when shooting from prone or behind cover. Unfortunately, this version with all these modifications made to it still ended up being too costly and complicated for wartime, as it still required tons of machining, as well as still featured the complex blish lock that the 1921 used. Just for some context, early models of the 1928, pre-1942, costed around $200 to make, whereas later SMGs like the Grease Gun only costed $20. This ultimately led to them simplifying the gun even more, and around 1942, they introduced the M1 Thompson, which removed the blish lock and simplified the action to a straight blowback system, dropped the cuts compensator and drum magazine capability, and replaced much of the complex machining with simpler parts like basic sights, stick mags only, and a smooth barrel. It effectively shot basically the same way, but for a much cheaper price. Oh, and you thought that was it? Nope. The military looked at that version and said, fuck it, let's make it even more simple. And this gave us the final M1A1 Thompson, which was definitely the most widely used Thompson of World War II. The biggest change they made to this version included using a fixed firing pin which was machined directly into the bolt. This allowed for even fewer parts, was even more cheap to produce, and was more durable and faster to build. So in short, it went from the 1921 to the 1928 to the 1928 A1 to the M1, and finally to the M1A1. This thing has gone through literally more revisions than some video game patches have. A rifle we saw back in the first Mummy film that makes its appearance again is the French Lebel Model 1886, an 8mm bolt-action rifle that holds a pretty important place in firearms history. The Lebel was the first military service rifle designed specifically for smokeless powder, which was a massive leap forward compared to older black powder weapons. Instead of instantly disappearing into a thick cloud of smoke after a few shots, soldiers could now fire at higher velocities with improved range and increased lethality, all while maintaining better visibility on the battlefield. The Lebel would go on to serve as the standard infantry rifle of the French Army throughout World War I. It earned a reputation for being rugged, dependable, and well suited for the brutal conditions of trench warfare. That said, it wasn't universally loved. Soldiers often criticized the rifle for its slow and awkward reloading process, especially when compared to faster cycling rifles of the era, like Britain's Lee-Enfield. Even so, the Lebel remained in production from 1887 to around 1920, with over 2.8 million rifles manufactured during its service life. Mechanically, the Lebel's design drew heavily from Kropotschek's rifle, which already featured an underbarrel tubular magazine and cartridge lifter, and was in use with the French Navy at the time. Chambered in 8x50mm Lebel, the rifle fed from an underbarrel tube holding 8 rounds, with an additional cartridge on the elevator and one in the chamber, for a theoretical capacity of 10 rounds. In practice, however, French soldiers rarely loaded the rifle this way. More often than not, troops were instructed to fire single shots and manually reload from their ammunition pouches, keeping the magazine tube fully loaded as a last-ditch reserve. This was actually made possible by the Lebel's magazine cutoff, which allowed soldiers to temporarily disable feeding from the tube altogether. In the last film, Rick mostly carried a pair of SMLE Delvine revolvers, but in this one, he swaps them out for 2 M1911A1s, and honestly, it's a really nice touch historically. Back in The Mummy, we saw him using the original M1911, not the updated A1 variant. That made a lot of sense because the story took place in 1926, only a couple years after the A1 changes were adopted in 1924, when most pistols in circulation were still the original 1911s. But by the sequel, which jumps ahead to 1933, Rick upgrades. Now he's running the newer A1s with the arch mainspring housing, shorter trigger, and relief cuts among other improvements. And it fits his character perfectly. Not only does Rick like being heavily armed, but by this point, he's also wealthy enough to afford the latest gear. That doesn't mean he's totally divorced from revolvers in this film. Early on, we can spot him carrying a unique Smith & Wesson, the classic Smith & Wesson 44 hand ejector, first model, New Century, or better known as the Triple Lock. Introduced in 1908, it debuted alongside the 44 Special cartridge and quickly earned a reputation as one of the most overbuilt, finely machined revolvers ever produced. The nickname comes from its 3 separate cylinder locking points. While most revolvers of the era locked at the front and the rear, the Triple Lock added a 3rd spring locking lug in the yoke, dramatically reducing cylinder play and improving strength and alignment. The result was a revolver that was exceptionally smooth, accurate, and durable, but also expensive and time-consuming to manufacture. That cost ultimately hurt it. Once World War I ramped up, Smith & Wesson simplified the design by removing the 3rd lock, creating the cheaper 2nd model hand ejector. Because of that, true triple locks were only produced from 1908 to about 1915, making originals relatively rare today. For Rick though, it makes perfect sense. A big, rugged, early 20th century revolver built like a tank and tough enough to survive sand, dust, and abuse. Exactly the kind of sidearm you'd expect from a former soldier turned adventurer. Like we did when we covered the original Mummy film, you know we gotta go through the contents of Rick's personal arsenal. Later on in the film, Rick basically upgrades from the little gun bag we saw in the first film to what is straight up a full-blown weapons trunk in the back of his car. When he pops it open, it's kind of hilarious just how much firepower he's casually carrying around with him. Inside, we can spot an M1928 Thompson front and center, along with a pair of M1911A1 pistols, and the Smith & Wesson triple lock revolver that we talked about earlier. There's also his Winchester 1887 shotgun, plus a sawed-off double barrel for when things get really up close and personal. On top of that, he's got extra bandoliers, already loaded up with shells and rifle ammo, a normal knife, a butterfly knife, and probably enough ammo to arm a small squad. Like the first movie, it's one of those moments that never really gets explained, but at the same time feels completely in character for Rick. Like, of course this guy just keeps an entire portable armory in his trunk at all times. One of the rifles you'll spot popping up throughout the film is the Lee-Enfield Mk I Mark III. And funny enough, it wasn't even called that at the time. During World War I, it was better known as the short magazine Lee-Enfield, or just the SMLE. This thing was basically the backbone of the British Army for decades. Adopted in the early 1900s to replace the old Lee Metfords, it stuck around all the way up until the late 1950s when it was finally replaced by the L1A1. For a bolt-action rifle, that's an insane service life. The Mark III entered service in 1907, and compared to most rifles of the era, it had a reputation for being stupidly fast. Between its smooth action and 10-round magazine capacity, trained soldiers could absolutely rip with these things. In fact, with stripper clips, for a trained soldier, you could realistically top off all 10 rounds in just a few seconds. One of the smarter upgrades was the fixed charger bridge. Earlier versions used a little guide attached to the bolt that soldiers kept breaking, so they just built it straight into the receiver instead. Simpler, tougher, and way more reliable. Chambered in .303 British and built like a tank, the SMLE combined capacity, speed, and durability, which pretty much explains why it shows up everywhere, from World War I trenches all the way to random desert shootouts in The Mummy Returns. During the Pygmy mummy attack in Shire, Jonathan can be seen with a very interesting rifle, which appears to be the Lee-Enfield Mk I CLLE, which stands for Charger Loading Lee-Enfield. And despite the complicated name, it really wasn't a brand new rifle at all. It was basically Britain trying to modernize what they already had. Before and even alongside the famous SMLE rifles most people recognize, the British were still sitting on thousands of older, long Lee-Enfields that originally lacked charger loading and had to be topped off manually, which was painfully slow compared to the stripper clip-fed Mausers other armies were using. So instead of throwing those rifles away, they retrofitted them with a fixed charger bridge that allowed soldiers to reload using 5-round stripper clips. instantly making them much more faster and more practical. Mechanically, it was still the same classic Enfield design, chambered in .303 British, with a 10-round magazine, and that famously smooth bolt that could be worked quickly. But even with the upgrade, these rifles were mostly issued to reservists, training units, and second-line troops, with only limited frontline use once newer SMLEs became available, since they were longer and more outdated than the newer, purpose-built Mark III that would soon take over as Britain's main frontline rifle. So the CLLE kind of represents this awkward in-between step. Not quite old, not quite modern, but an interesting piece of how the Lee-Enfield family evolved. Also during the same fight, like that of Jonathan, Evelyn appears to be using a really unique rifle as well. She can be seen using what looks like a Lee Speed Sporter, and this gun has a pretty interesting history. After licensing James Paris Lee's bolt-action system, Birmingham Small Arms Company began producing refined commercial sporting rifles built around the same smooth action used in the military Lee-Enfields. These became known as Lee Speed rifles, named after Joseph Speed, one of the factory managers who helped refine the design. Unlike the bulky military versions, the Lee Speed featured slimmer wood furniture, checkering, polished finishes, and none of the extra military hardware like bayonet lugs or volley sights. It was lighter, more elegant, and clearly built for hunters, explorers, and well-off civilians rather than soldiers in the trenches. Mechanically though, it still kept all the best parts of the Lee-Enfield, that buttery smooth bolt and the detachable magazine, meaning you basically had military level firepower and a much more refined sporting package. So honestly, for a character like Evelyn, it makes perfect sense. It's practical and reliable, but feels way more like something an adventurer or an archaeologist would personally own, rather than something pulled off a battlefield. Now the real question. You're headed into the desert to fight an army of Anubis warriors? Tell me what gun you're going with in the comments. And if you want to see where this all started, check out my full breakdown of the original 1999 The Mummy right here. That one's packed with all the classic Rick gear. And if you want to help support us on Patreon, over there we post the uncut versions of these videos with extra movie clips, more behind the scenes, and I actually just started posting exclusive content over there too that won't be up here on YouTube. So if you're interested, check that out. It's only $1 a month, and links in the video's description. Alright, I'll catch you in the next one.